Important, I thought to mention that indeed I am a member from it, so I'm here as a federal representative, but I'm here primarily in my capacity of solidarity with everything that's going on, but also as the Democratic Reform critic. Because with my remarks, I hope to show you how what you are all both experiencing and fighting for has implications for how we think about democracy itself. One of the things that gets very little play in our political system, except occasionally within municipal boundaries, is participatory democracy. But the first rule of contemporary environmental law and policy is citizen participation and the importance of citizen knowledge in making sure that decisions that are made on projects that are economic projects or projects like the quarry are made on the basis of full knowledge and the fact that citizens often know more and better than institutions. And so it's in that light that I wanted to speak very briefly on three themes. The first theme I'll get to is the question of trust and confidence in government procedures. The second is the importance of using food and water security as an absolute baseline when we talk about environmental assessment. And thirdly, the whole question of solidarity and civic activism. So first of all, this question of trust. Let's not forget, this seems to be elided by the company, and the company may be doing this in full good faith from its own perspective. But what's being elided here is this is a 40-year-old license. Okay? 40 years, 4 decades have passed. So there's so much more general scientific knowledge, all within the hands of government, and citizen understanding of that knowledge than there would have been 40 years ago. Yet the public process involved in giving the license for this land to be designated as aggregate land only occurred 40 years ago and has not been replicated. And in that context, the attempt to get the MNR, the Ministry of Natural Resources, to overturn, not overturn, but to revisit the license by virtue of having a new process is, to me, it seemed eminently sensible. The Environmental Commissioner had referred it to the MNR for its internal review under the Environmental Bill of Rights. I've had a chance to look at the report. I'm not going to say offhand that it's a bad report, but it seems to be an inadequate report in taking into account what knowledge can be brought to the table by folks in this room. When you look to see what's in the back, some of the back information panels in this pamphlet, it's not at all clear to me that those points were brought to the fore in the MNR analysis. So I have some hope that the Environmental Commissioner, in his role now reviewing the MNR internal review, might himself have something to say. That's at least one element of the process that is left outstanding. And brought to the table, they did address it in the report, I'm not going to say they didn't, is the concerns of people who've been watching aggregate and other kinds of extraction activities around Ontario, been looking at mining activity, who realize that the provincial government, like all governments, but maybe even more so in Ontario, is under intense financial pressure. Resources are being cut everywhere, financial resources. And so the question is, what kind of enforcement, attention, and diligence exists at the level of the provincial government to do the correct job? This question was asked, and it was addressed in the report, but I'm here to say that probably not adequately. It basically indicated we will be watching what happens, we will be monitoring, there are conditions in place, and the question that raises is indeed one of trust. And without a process whereby all of you can once again say, okay, 40 years ago is 40 years ago, 2013 is 2013. And if in the end some decision is made, at least you'll be in a better position to know whether or not the decision has any validity or whether or not something else is going on. And this question of the need to be confident, to have trust in a government decision-making of this nature, it's not something that occurs in isolation. All of you will be aware that at the federal level, so much has happened in a very short space of time since the federal Conservative government got into power in 2011 to, they would say streamline, they would say deregulate, they would say a bunch of things that have a neutral terminology to it. but frankly, all ends up gutting the kinds of environmental protections we have built up over the decades. In a recent Budgetary Implementation Act, it had nothing to do with the budget, but they entirely replaced the Environmental Assessment Act in a way that strips out all kinds of triggers for federal environmental review and gives all kinds of added discretion to the federal cabinet, even when environmental reviews take place. And this turned out to be just the start, because in the next Budgetary Implementation Act, something called the Navigable Waters Protection Act was renamed into the Navigation Protection Act. Effectively, I think that's the new title. And in the process, thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, it's in the tens of thousands of rivers and lakes that had previously been protected through interconnections between that Navigable Waters Protection Act and the environmental legislation federally were removed. And only a very small number of lakes and rivers were retained to have any kind of a protective focus from that act, and most of the protection is now oriented more towards making sure that navigation is not affected, as opposed to making sure that waters themselves are protected. And this is just an example of what's going on federally, and so it's in that context that confidence is lacking. It's one reason my party federally, the NDP, has been running for many, many months now a campaign to draw attention to this by tabling private members' bills to restore protection of rivers and lakes that have been taken out of the system back into environmental protection at the federal level. And I have to say that the Grand River is one of the rivers that's been removed from the Act for this segment. The segment around Cambridge and here, a little bit further south, they've retained that within the Act, whatever the reasoning is. But right next to Paris and north is no longer protected. If you think that is an issue, quite apart from the connection between the quarry and possibly the whole question of pesticide leakage and whether that might make its way into the nearby proximate Grand River, it's maybe one of the lower on the list issues around the quarry, I'm not sure. But there's a petition somewhere in the room, Marc Laferriere I see here, from the local NDP and also here, that basically calls on the federal government to restore that protection. For every 25 signatures, it allows me to get up in the House of Commons at least once to table this and put pressure on them. And you will be seeing a private member's bill being presented by an NDP MP at some point to restore the Grand River to protection of the Navigable Water Protection Act. Now, all of that was about the theme of lack of trust and confidence in government. Okay, that's an example, and it's like serious at the federal level. Now, provincially, be very careful here. It's not a matter of trying to be partisan, but it's a matter of being realistic. I'll give you an example. The current government, in its former iteration, when Mr. McGuinty was the premier, got a lot of accolades indeed to that North American-wide prize for bringing in something called the Places to Grow Act in 2006. It's intended to be an act that would exercise all kinds of protections for making sure that urban expansion, especially in the GTA, doesn't gobble up farmland, including some of the best arable land in the country and in Ontario, obviously. 7 years later, a study and then coverage, really good article I recommend you all Google and find by Thomas Walcom in the Toronto Star, tells us that not a single application by any municipality to continue to extend building and suburbs and development onto the lands that were supposed to be protected by the Places to Grow Act, not a single one was rejected. And the Act was designed to have that exemption. The exemption was if the municipality came up with really good reasons why the growth limits in the Act could be set aside, then some discretion could be exercised to do that. And the idea was there might be some exceptions. We can't actually guess what all municipalities might face, therefore we're going to have this exception. What happened? Exception produced a Mack truck driving through it. And basically, I'm not going to go much further than to say that it's important to know, here's democracy for you, it's important to know that in Ontario, it's still the case that corporations can donate to political parties. Okay? And they can donate a fair bit of money. And developers are amongst the best donors to political parties. Not mine, but others. We have our own issue, in the sense that we also can receive money from unions. So it's a two-way street. I'm not saying it's different, but I'm saying that money is potentially influencing environmental protection in this province. So the whole question is not for me to stir up trouble and say, you shouldn't trust government, but there are all kinds of pressures and reasons why government has to earn your trust when it comes to an issue like this quarry. Okay? The second theme I wanted to mention, and this is where it's so obvious to all of you in this room, you are on the front lines of both fighting for this and articulating why this is important. Food and water security has to be at the very heart of policy at provincial, federal, and obviously municipal level. And it's not as if this quarry is just any quarry. It's a quarry that sits over top of an aquifer. It's an aquifer that actually is the aquifer for a vibrant town. And it's not so far away from the Grand River at the same time. What else should we know about it? It's not Scrabble land, hard Scrabble land. It's arable land, all right? And so agricultural land, protection of agricultural land, aquifers, water tables, a need to have special attention when it comes to the question of licensing or renewing the license or reviewing the license of aggregate companies. Especially, there's some evidence, I'm not saying this is clear, especially when there are some who were in the industry and are now writing about the question, saying that there are far more, or at least more, aggregate licenses out there than are needed. And so if that's the case, then surely we should be turning to other principles that, to principles like food and water security first. Carl Kosak is going to be telling us, I think, a little bit about his own experience, and he just reminded me again of the long-standing precautionary principle. It has to be front row and center, especially when we know that the aggregate policy regime at the moment, and this seems not to have been changed by the Aggregate Resources Act review for which a report just came out in Queen's Park. There are two principles or two philosophies that seem to be getting precedence over the question of food and water security. One is this idea of no need to show need. The idea that extracting aggregate is just another industry. If you've gotten a license, then you can just respond to the market as you see it. And there's no further need to say that there is a general need or there's a special need to be using aggregate from an area that is particularly sensitive compared to other areas that might still be available and don't have the same kind of implications when it comes to touching on water and food. The second principle that seems to be quite prevalent in the way in which decisions get made is closest to market. So the idea that the closer you are to the big Southern Ontario urban centres that will want to use a lot of this aggregate stacks the deck against a place like Paris, like Brant County. Now there are environmental reasons that kind of cut back and say that's not fully, it's a principle that has some integrity simply because you don't want to be hauling stuff too far over roads and the kind of the climate change impact and all that. But at some level, the question of not sourcing further afield where you know you're not going to be causing food and water security risks has to be put into the equation. And it's not clear to me from reading the review that was necessarily the attention being paid in the hearings. And maybe that committee had its hands tied because they didn't ask the right questions to get the right answers. I can't speak for them. This is the Queen's Park Committee. And so I would say that it's absolutely important that food and water security be fought for and recognized, and all the knowledge in the room about why they could potentially be threatened by this quarry has to be marshaled in a way that ultimately wins the day. And that brings me to my third point. And that's the role of civic organizing. As I was reminded by Mark Laferriere, my colleague Charlie Angus, who has a history in the north of fighting fights along these lines and winning, is if you rely only on the established institutional process to come out right and win the day simply based on what you understand to be the rational evidence, then you're likely to lose. Without mobilization, especially when there are already signs that the institutions are not interested in opening up the issue again, without civic organizing, and here's the second quotient, without solidarity, without a smaller municipality like Paris receiving solidarity from a larger city like Toronto, without the immediate solidarity going on now between the rural regions around Paris and Paris town itself, then you're going to be having an uphill struggle. The fight, resistance, and pushing the politics of the decision-making is going to be absolutely crucial. I won't step in and take up the time that Carl is so much better to talk on, but my own involvement, let's call it very marginal compared to so many other people, but myself and a couple of other MPs in Toronto did everything we could to send the message in Toronto that what was going on with the mega quarry was not just wrong in terms of what it was threatening for the aquifer there and arable land, but it was a matter of moral imperative for us in the city, because we're the ones that, in the names of which all of this activity is going on, because this is where so much of the building and other material was bound for. Right on the border between my riding, Toronto Danforth, and Beaches East York and Woodbine Park, I think the camel that broke the straw that broke the camel's back occurred with, Carol, I'm not sure if you know how many, but thousands.
That's my speech.
Thousands of people showed up to hear this guy who you're about to hear, and that finally caused the company to say, we get it, we're wrong, the formal process can end, and that's how the victory was achieved. And so at that level, the whole question of participatory democracy is not only about you plugging yourself into what the laws allow you to do, and when they don't allow you to do it, you have nothing left to do. Participatory democracy does involve doing exactly what the concerned citizens of Brant are already doing in such an impressive way, and learning from the experience of people like Carl, who I now cede the floor to. Carl.